Welcome to the Politics and Public Finance Podcast, in-depth conversations that bring unique insights into the nexus between how governments manage our finances and the work of elective representative bodies such as parliaments. You're listening to Politics and Public Finance Podcast with Jeff Dubrow.
Hi, I'm Jeff Dubrow, and welcome to Politics and Public Finance. This week, we'll talk to Parliamentary Leader of the Federal Green Party of Canada, Elizabeth May, MP, about the damage, the prospects, and how to do better next time in the wake of the invocation of the Emergencies Act this past February. We'll also talk to Lawrence Ayagaba, who is the Deputy Auditor General of Ghana, on how the Ghana Audit Service works with Parliament and engages Parliament to make sure its findings are acted upon by the government. But first, this is the second in a series of episodes that we've done related to the invocation of the Emergencies Act in Canada. 50 years it has been since the last time that a emergency was invoked in Canada at the federal level. And so it's important not to let this issue rest. We're seeing the decline of democracies all around the world and the quality of those democracies. So as a result, it is absolutely essential that we as citizens make sure that our institutions are working effectively. And as a society, we learn from what happened during the invocation of the Emergencies Act. There was a failure of leadership at all levels of government. And so that makes this particular issue even more complex. To unpack that issue today, I'm joined by Elizabeth May, the Parliamentary Leader of the Federal Green Party of Canada. Ms. May, welcome to Politics and Public Finance.
Thanks, Jeff. It's good to be with you.
It's great to have you here. So talking about the Emergencies Act, in a speech you made in the House of Commons on February 17th, you expressed concern about a future government misusing the Emergencies Act. Could you elaborate on your concern and how it was addressed?
Well, I have to say I spent a lot of time working on as a former lawyer, working through the legal analysis if I thought the Emergencies Act applied to the situation we were in. And I concluded that it did. My concern about misuse was the way in which the regulations were drafted. Did the regulations as drafted provide too much reach for the federal government? In other words, were they restricted to this situation, or was there an opportunity for the Emergencies Act to be used for different groups, different populations than what we were talking about as the specific problems at border crossings and specifically the occupation of Ottawa? And it took a while. I had lots of back and forth. I have to say that the ministers that I worked with most closely through this, Marco Mendicino as Minister for Public Safety and David Lametti as Minister of Justice, I raised with them concerns that I heard from my constituents. There were a lot of people concerned, for instance, about a freezing of bank accounts. How widespread would that be? What would the safeguards be? And we also had concerns about the number of installations that were listed on the regulation. I mean, everything from every lighthouse in Canada to every border crossing. I said, well, now, wait a minute. Are we talking about this specific emergency, or would any activity there allow the Emergencies Act provisions to be employed? So it really wasn't until, and we'd worked it out, certainly through many meetings, that they wanted to give me that assurance. They said that was indeed the case. But as your listeners may not know, legal opinions given to the Government of Canada are not shared. So they said, no, the Department of Justice has been all over this, and we're absolutely sure. And I said, but I need to know.
Absolutely.
So in the end, what happened was we had, during the day of the debate on Monday, and this was a very intense weekend because it was supposed to be the long family weekend, and I was supposed to be home, but instead it was 7 a.m. till midnight, all day Saturday, all day Sunday, and Monday morning, 7 a.m. till 8, and then we voted. And the one thing that was like a normal parliament that wasn't just one issue being debated nonstop, 17 hours Monday, 17 hours Saturday, and Sunday, 17 hours a day. Monday, a bit less. And we did have a question period. And luckily for me, I was able to put the question to the Minister of Justice. And in a previous question, the Minister of Public Safety set out clearly so that any future court looking back would know what were the parameters of these regulations. And I got it boxed in, and I got the Minister of Public Safety to make it clear that the freezing of bank accounts could only start with any actual transactions that had been made starting that previous Monday when the Emergencies Act was invoked by the federal cabinet, and no previous. So there'd been some things in the media, for instance, that had alarmed my constituents. The idea that people who had donated $20 to buy a T-shirt or something to support the convoy were going to have, or even had their bank accounts frozen. I was able to ascertain that that had not happened, and that it was only between the Monday and then in the end, it was only a 9-day period that the Emergencies Act was in force. But in that period, nobody could act to freeze a bank account without due process, without going through the steps that one would be required to take to respect the charter. And the bigger question for me was on the regulations. How limited was the impact of the regulations? And the answer from the Minister of Justice on the record in question period, which again, if a future court or a future instance, this would be very, very helpful to prove that no, this wasn't any place across the country. Yes, they described things broadly, but the use of the Emergencies Act declaration was confined to this specific protest called the Freedom Convoy and nothing else.
Yeah, and I think the reason I wanted to discuss this on this podcast was, as a democracy, looking at the decline of democracies all around the world. It's important when something like this happens, almost once in a generation, that we examine it and we make sure that our institutions are holding the fact that this was held to a high standard, but also learning from this issue.
I think
I guess in a
sorry.
22nd, your colleague, fellow Green MP Mike Morris said that, and I quote, "Now that the occupation and blockades have been cleared, we need to take action to address the deep divisions in our society, the rise of white supremacy, and evaluate the police and government response." So I'd like to spend some time unpacking that statement. Perhaps we could start with the deep divisions. What do you see as those deep divisions?
Well, I was to say that Mike and I worked together on this, and
Of
as
course.
Greens, we came to consensus. Even though we voted different ways, we agreed with each other, which is a really good step. And we also agreed with our leader, interim leader Amita Kutner. They were very strongly involved in saying, well, look, what are we looking at as these divisions? We are concerned. Well, I mean, the divisions, I think, reflect some of the people in politics, including the prime minister, but also including opposition party members in the Conservative Party, have tried to exploit people's differences to advance their party's interests, which I think is a very big mistake. So when Justin Trudeau dropped the writ August 15th of last summer, right off the bat, he said, well, the election campaign is about people who aren't vaccinated. Well, that's not right at all. I mean, why would you have an election campaign over turning a public health issue into a political partisan issue? That opened the door to a lot of what we have seen since, which is a lot of social media disinformation sites. A lot of them, the disinformation emanated from, believe it or not, Russia. Russian disinformation
I
sites
believe it.
played. Yeah. So we have Russian disinformation sites were actually the disinformation site called Russia Today, or RT, was ruled as available content by CRTC and was on multiple cable channels across Canada. I found that shocking. It's no longer available.
No, it's been
But
outlawed. Yeah.
yeah, so what you have is, depending on what website one thinks of as their news source, you end up getting propaganda from whatever side you're talking about it, instead of what we used to have in Canada. Gosh, as I was growing up, we all knew, if you watched Knowlton Nash and the National, or you watched Lloyd Robertson on CTV, you tended to, as a population or a gathering around the water cooler at work, everybody had the same set of information. What we have now are completely different sets of alleged facts. Some of them are accurate and some of them aren't. I have a lot of constituents who write me honestly believing that something they've read is of the same validity as if it was back in the day CTV News and Lloyd Robertson or CBC News and Knowlton Nash. You never would watch Knowlton Nash and Lloyd Robertson and hear completely different information. You might get slightly different, you'd get different quality of news coverage, but we are really at a dangerous place, and I think it is dangerous, where people can believe firmly. For instance, I have some constituents who believe firmly that Donald Trump really won the election.
Yeah.
So these sites are also connected to US disinformation. So Fox News, Russia Today, Rebel News, some of these places aren't sources of news, they're sources of propaganda. But it's very hard for the average citizen, once they've fallen into believing that one of these propaganda sites is actually reliable information, and then that the government is lying to you. Well, in that circumstance, I think what we really need, which is why we called for it at the end of the emergencies vote, is we need a full investigation inquiry, and we need to understand and bring Canadians together by saying, okay, let's listen to everything. Let's make sure nothing is off limits for people to ask about. Let's let's assume, as I do, that Canadians are reasonable people and that we can disagree without being disagreeable, and find out, can we all agree on what really happened here? And that would be a big step forward over having different camps that firmly believe that there's all sorts of skullduggery around information. I think we have to be able to share what we know, and we have to say, where is there uncertainty on the science? What do we learn about COVID-19? How do we prepare for the next pandemic? And I think those questions need to be honestly and transparently addressed so we can rebuild public trust in the idea that we have a shared
Yeah,
set of
you're
facts.
definitely raising some larger issues on the Emergencies Act, and the fact that you're saying really the Emergencies Act was a microcosm for some wider societal issues that we're dealing with. And just going back to the statement that the party made, you mentioned the need to address white supremacy, and as well as the police and government response to the crisis and blockade of Ottawa originally. Do you want to address those issues as well? It was
Yeah.
shocking for me to see that white supremacy was an issue that was considered serious enough, and I'm not questioning that, but rather it was very dismaying to see that it was an issue that was serious enough that it made it onto that press release or that statement.
Yeah, well, I mean, there were very clearly there were double standards in the policing response in Ottawa. A lot of us as members of parliament, but also involved in various activist organizations, know that there's been times that Indigenous protesters have come up to Parliament Hill and attempted to erect a tent. Before you can get a tent peg in the ground, they're arrested. So how is it that 18-wheelers were told where to park? How is it that people were able to bring bales of hay and create open fires on the streets to warm themselves? How is it that the downtown core and several neighborhoods were occupied with what appears to be, now this is one of the good things about the Emergencies Act that I should highlight, is that it was drafted in the late 1980s by a bunch of MPs who were not at that moment in an emergency. So they were, I think, thinking quite clearly, and I think the Emergencies Act is very well crafted. When you study it, there's 4 different kinds of emergencies that are covered. One of them is war, and a lot of people speak of the Emergencies Act as though it was the War Measures Act, which it wasn't.
Right.
And under all these provisions, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms is protected. The military, except for the war measure, you can't call out the military under a public welfare emergency, which would cover a climate emergency or a pandemic, or a public order emergency, which is the one that was used around the occupation of Ottawa. And by the way, we were still dealing with a lot of threats to Windsor and other border crossings when they brought in the Emergencies Act. And the last type of emergency is an international emergency. But they all require that within 7 days of the cabinet deciding to put forward a declaration of emergency, the Parliament must meet and debate and vote. And if Parliament says no, then that's the end. But at the same time, a committee of Parliament involving MPs and senators must be set up. Now that's already happened, and must report. But also required under the Emergencies Act is a 1-year period of an inquiry from an arm's length. In this case, Judge Rouleau has been appointed. I hope that we can get to the bottom of a lot of what went on. Why was it that the Ottawa police, at least some officers, appeared to welcome and assist lawbreakers? Now, I think it's a nice tactic to be so welcoming to protesters, but the racial element here is we know for sure that a Black Lives Matter protest or an Indigenous rights protest would have been hauled off and arrested before being allowed to create a single structure like a stage, or my goodness. And this was the most sophisticated, well-funded, well-resourced in terms of they had additional, I don't know how many people in New Brunswick know this, but I mean, they had farms outside of Ottawa that were set up as resupply zones.
Yeah.
So that constant supplies of diesel were being brought in to keep the trucks going, constant resupplies of food and so on. It was a very well organized and sophisticated operation. But there's a lot of questions about what happened for the Ottawa police. Was it a breakdown in the chain of command? Where were the provincial officials? In other words, you wouldn't have needed the Emergencies Act on day one of this event to clear it away. You needed it, on weeks in, where it was clear that there was an entrenchment of an occupation and that it was affecting the health and quality of life of the people of Ottawa, specifically the center town, lower town neighborhoods were in deep distress. All of that to say, we have the inquiry to look into it, but we also know not only how different protests are treated on Parliament Hill, but we know that they have the brutality, and it is police brutality that I've seen videoed in response to the Wet'suwet'en people on their own territory in British Columbia, to the protesters who are protesting the logging of old growth on Vancouver Island at a place called Fairy Creek. This is very, very different and brutal, and not at all like what you see with the friendly hugs and welcomes to white protesters. And that's a clear distinction between the convoy folks and and I'm sure there were many who showed up for the convoy protests who were really lovely people and didn't know that this protest was going to become a security threat, which it did become. There are a lot of people who were dragged along into it who were really well-meaning, and I don't take away from that. But the treatment of racialized people who walked through the convoy versus white people who walked through the convoy, we had a lot of incidents where members of Parliament who were non-white were harassed and threatened. And then you'd also have, the older white men in the Conservative Party saying, I walk to work every day. I don't mind walking through the convoy. Well, you got treated quite differently than younger, racialized, or queer.
A little bit of white privilege there.
Just a bit.
Yeah, I want to ask you in the minutes we have left, do you see, what prospects do you see for the parliamentary inquiry, which I do note is jointly chaired by two opposition parties, which is quite impressive as a sort of structural feature of the parliamentary inquiry. But what prospects do you see for the parliamentary inquiry and the judicial inquiry, or the inquiry headed by the judge, to actually get to the bottom of this? And will there just be finger pointing at the end with different levels of government saying, well, it was their fault?
Well, I hope, I have more hope. Actually, I've sat in on some of the meetings where I can of the parliamentary inquiry. I wasn't able to become a member of the committee. I had hoped I might be, but I have been dismayed by the extent of partisanship, and the kind of questioning of witnesses has been, I think, a bit like they've been watching too much US TV of US Congress style questioning of people. I think we should be respectful when we're questioning the RCMP or CSIS or the minister or whatever. But they will have some finding of facts that will be helpful. But the full inquiry for a full year by the judge, I want to track that really closely. I want answers. I want to know, how did this happen that we ended up needing the Emergencies Act? And I do believe we needed it. I voted for it. I believe, and the legal requirements for a threat to national security were met, and that's a very specific set of words. It's not subjective. It's under a different act called the Canadian Security Intelligence Act, whether a threat to national security has occurred. And the tests were met here. But how did that happen? I mean, we've had convoys before. We had a convoy protesting the Liberals' Impact Assessment Act, came in, rolled in from Alberta and rolled right out. The idea of setting up an occupation, taking over a national capital, I think this idea was germinated in the United States and launched through Alberta into Ottawa. That's my view, just looking at information. I wouldn't assert it as a fact. I want to know, is that what happened? I'm hoping with the full year and the resources of a full parliamentary inquiry, or the full judicial inquiry, we'll find out more. And I think we really Canadians need to know why did the Ottawa police fail to act sooner? Why did the province of Ontario not act? At the end of the day, I think that it was very clear that Doug Ford, as Premier, welcomed what the federal government did to get this cleared out. Certainly the Mayor of Ottawa was very relieved when the federal government used the Emergencies Act. Should it have gotten that far? I don't think so. I think it should have been handled earlier, more effectively. And I want to know, as someone who was in the midst of it, and I have to say it wasn't a comfortable experience. I did feel somewhat threatened, and I did need the RCMP did provide protection to help me get back and forth to Parliament Hill every day. How did that happen? And that I do have confidence that the judicial inquiry with a full year will get to the bottom of things, because Canadians have a right to know.
And I hope that when that happens, that hopefully as citizens we can be part of that process in terms of questioning the report and pushing for all levels of government to be accountable, because it really was a failure of leadership at all levels of government, federal, provincial, municipal, and at the police level.
Well, I don't know what the federal government could have done at the very beginning of this, because it isn't a federal issue to police the streets of Ottawa. We're having an ongoing debate. I really hope we don't further wall off Ottawa. The main street where the convoy was parked is still not open to regular traffic, and I think that's a mistake. I think Canadians and people who live in Ottawa should have the right to drive up and down Wellington Street in front of Parliament Hill. I'm hoping that that won't become taken over as a response to the security issue. Every time we have a security, and I was in Parliament when the shootings occurred in October of 2014, and that was a very disturbing incident, and obviously tragic that Nathan Cirillo was killed at the National War Memorial. It was a terrible and shaking incident. But the changes that were made for security following that, I think, have been in error. So I'll continue to push for answers, because I came to my own conclusion in the way I voted, and Mike came to his conclusion in the way he voted. But neither one of us are going to settle for pat answers. We want to make sure that we get to the bottom of everything that took place.
Ms. Ming, I want to thank you very much for your time. It was great to have you on the podcast.
Thank you, Jeff. It was good to join you.
Elizabeth May is the Parliamentary Leader of the Federal Green Party of Canada. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And now, in order to effectively oversee public spending, Parliament relies on the Auditor General to report and investigate malfeasance. Yet audit reports don't necessarily guarantee value for money or prudent spending in the future. To discuss this issue, I'm joined by Lawrence Ayagaba, who's the Deputy Auditor General of Ghana. Lawrence, welcome to Politics and Public Finance.
Thank you very much, Jeff.
Wonderful to have you.
Thank you. It's evening here, and good afternoon to you in Canada.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Lawrence, how many years have you been working at the Ghana Audit Service?
I've been working with the Ghana Audit Service for the past 20 years.
Wow, 20 years. Well, that question is going to come back to us, because I'm going to ask you a few questions later about how things have changed over the last 20 years. And that's why I wanted to know the answer to that. But let's start from the beginning and say, why is it so important that the Ghana Audit Service specifically, but also external audit offices around the world generically, why is it so close that they work with Parliament? Or why is it so important that they work closely with Parliament?
Thank you very much, Jeff. External auditors, just like Ghana Audit Service and Parliament, need to work closely. First of all, the constitutions of our countries mandates us to report our reports to Parliament. So the parliamentarians and especially the PAC, our main stakeholders,
The Public
all our
Accounts
reports
Committee.
go to them. That is one. Secondly, we need to ensure that there's accountability, executive accountability. And it is only the Parliament, representative of the people, who can hold the executive accountable through the working of the Auditor General. The third issue that we need to work closely with the Auditor General is to be able to prove and to demonstrate our existence. We need to see how many of our recommendations are being implemented to bring the necessary change that we want. And to be able to achieve that, we need to work closely with the parliamentarians to make sure that our recommendations are implemented by the executive.
So now you said you've been with the Ghana Audit Service for 20 years. How have things changed in the last 20 years in terms of the relationship between the Ghana Audit Service and Parliament?
Yes, in Ghana, for instance, until 1992, when we had our constitution, the 1992 constitution, Ghana was ruled by a military regime. So in 1992, there was a constitutional change and political parties were, ban on political party was lifted, and many political parties now came into being. So when we had an election in 1992, the military ruler became a civilian president until 2000, when there was a change of regime. So between 1981 to 1992, we actually had only one person as president. Real parliamentary democracy came after 2000 election. That was when parliamentary democracy came. We had a very fledgling democracy. Parliament, the quality of parliamentarians were not all that high because they thought that people were not interested in it. Then those days we had to work hard to make sure that Parliament took Auditor General's report to hold the executive accountable. Now, at that same time, we had CCAF from Canada, and I think Jeff played a very crucial role in building the capacity of our parliamentarians. I remember as early as 1996, 98, Jeff was in Ghana to take the parliamentarians through the relationship with the Auditor General's office, how to take audit reports, what to look for in the audit reports. So kept on building their capacity.
So that was more like 2007, I think it was.
That was 2007.
2007, but this was not supposed to be about me.
No. Yes, but what I'm saying is the contribution of CCAF, where you played a role. You know, we had
the Canadian Comprehensive Audit Foundation.
Yes,
now known as the Canadian Audit and Accountability Foundation.
Yes, yes. We had our development partners that saw the need to build the capacity of parliamentarians and the audit service to work closely. You know, they saw that that was the only way we could get things done. So Parliament has, and the work of the Parliament and the Ghana Audit Service has now developed from those capacity building processes, and we have a very close relationship now, to the extent that we have a liaison officer, somebody who is supposed to be a liaison officer between the Ghana Audit Service and Parliament.
So just before we get to the Ghana, I'd like to hear about that liaison officer, because I think it will be interesting for listeners. But before we get to that, so you're saying that essentially when you joined the office in 2002, Ghana had just started to have a parliamentary democracy. And so the Parliament, in acting on the reports of the auditor, was relatively new. Is that correct?
Yes, it was relatively new. And right. So, yeah.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, it was relatively new. And they didn't also know how to address the issues raised by the Auditor General.
Right. So what changed in the culture of the office once Parliament became more able to review the reports? Because the title of this podcast is Beyond the Ivory Tower, because some audit offices, and I'm not suggesting yours is like this, but some audit offices are seen as ivory towers.
Yes, what happened was we also introduced I think it was also through the Canadian Auditing and Accountability Foundation where we introduced this broadcasting, live broadcast of tabling when the PAC is sitting to take the audit reports, where it was telecast live, and with that, people took it very serious because they were shown on TV. They didn't want to see that because they'll be questioned. It became live.
Right. So you're referring to the fact that the hearings of the Public Accounts Committee, which is the parliamentary committee that looks at the Auditor General's report, became live, so people could actually watch it. There was that transparency that people could participate or view it.
Yeah. So it became very transparent. They could hear the people question, and whatever they did, Parliament was able to sanction them there, and the people saw that they were addressing the issue that they were actually concerned with. So there had been that development throughout.
And then you made reference to the liaison office. So tell us about how the liaison office functions and what is its role?
Yes. So what happened is we have a parliamentary liaison that is supposed to be the link between Parliament and the Office of the Auditor General. So every report that we produce that has to be submitted to Parliament will pass through him. Any sittings that Parliament need to invite the Auditor General to come and brief them on the report, they don't need to come to the audit. They just inform the liaison officer. And he has an office created under the Auditor General. He reports direct to the Auditor General. Now, the liaison officer is also supposed to take the recommendations after every sitting of the PAC. The liaison officer takes whatever reports and recommendations that the PAC makes, brings it back to the Auditor General's office for a follow-up, because those are the recommendations that we follow during our follow-up audits. And that's how we find out how many of our recommendations have been implemented.
So this all goes back to serving the public, right? How have Ghanaians benefited from this closer relationship between the audit service and Parliament?
Yes, because what happened, one, is that Ghanaians have now seen that the issues that they worry about are being addressed, and as you know, our parliamentary system is the Westminster system. So the head of the PAC is actually the opposition. The chairman of the PAC is from the opposition. So, that resemblance of transparency is there, and that makes them comfortable that, look, here's the case, the head of the PAC is from the opposition, so he's not going to shield anything that has been exposed by the Auditor General.
It's not a whitewash.
No, it's not a whitewash at all. Yeah, exactly.
Right. But I imagine there's also that that Ghanaians are benefiting from the fact that Parliament is pushing the executive branch to implement the auditor's findings. Would you agree with that?
Yes. Because what happened is when the reports are tabled and they are sitting on any report, the minister responsible for that institution or the MDA is also present, and he's supposed to come up with a plan on how the recommendations will be implemented. So that gives us an added advantage and the benefit to the Ghanaian public, that whatever recommendations that are made will be implemented, because the minister responsible is the one giving the answers.
That makes a lot of sense. I wrote a publication for the Westminster Foundation for Democracy a couple of years ago. I think, in fact, you provided some guidance for me on the document. And one of the things I mentioned was that, unfortunately, in a lot of low and middle income countries, one of the challenges is that the audit office needs to spend a great deal of its time reviewing individual transactions. And I mentioned that if internal audit offices were stronger, that they could play that role, and that would allow the Auditor General to look much more at the big picture. Would you agree with that statement?
Yes, absolutely, Jeff, and that is on point. And the audit service too has been, propagating that idea that we need to strengthen the internal audit agency. And Ghana here, I think it's on the drawing board that the internal audit agency will be elevated to a higher level so that they could do more work, so that the external auditors will be going to do things like performance audit, actually looking beyond the numbers. Now, we also have these audit committees. That is a creation of the public financial management system that the act has been passed, where every organization, MDA, is supposed to have a audit audit committee. And those audit committees are to ensure the implementation of audit recommendations by external and internal auditors. Now, if the internal auditors are strengthened, it means that they will be doing their work, the day-to-day reviewing of files and weaknesses, so that external auditors would not go back there to be doing exactly what they were supposed to do. Then we will now look at especially performance audit and value for money.
And you are one of the leaders, if not the leader, in developing, you're personally in developing, in leading the performance audit practice at the Ghana Audit Service. What percentage of your resources right now is focused on performance audit as opposed to the financial audit?
Yes, our resources now is about 30%, but we're expecting that it should go higher than that, because traditionally, Ghana Audit Service has been doing financial and regulatory audit. So with time, we're not trying to build our capacity of the from the beginning. We started with about 20 staff of the performance audit unit. Now we are 56.
Wow.
56, and we are training. We are training more. We want to now decentralize to other parts of the country so that it will reduce our traveling cost, so that we could see how we'll do performance audit at the local level, because more money is now sent to the local level under the District Assembly Common Fund concept. So more money is now sent there, to build schools, roads, and cheap compounds. Cheap compounds are just these community hospitals. A lot of money is sent to build them, so that we can look at all those ones from the district level.
Well, your instincts are good. Considering gas prices, it's probably a good idea to have that decentralization, so you're reducing your travel costs.
Yes.
Let's just talk finally about independence of the offices. Of course, theoretically, we all know about the Lima Declaration, the Mexico Declaration. From your experience, though, is independence of the audit office, that is their ability to develop their own budgets and hire their own staff. Is this still a challenge in Africa? And if so, why?
Yes, independence of the audit service is very paramount if we actually have to do our work as required. But like all other sites in Africa, and not only Ghana, we have the independent, but it's limited. For example, like the tenure of the Auditor General is not defined. Second, the Auditor General is appointed by the President. Third, our budget is still controlled, So these are the three things. But like for employing our own staff, interviewing them, and that we have the independence to employ our own staff, we're allowed to do that. But so the independence is not absolute. We still have some small challenges, like as I told you, the tenure of the office, then budgets. We're still controlled by the Ministry of Finance. So these are the issues, the gray areas.
But that's interesting, because I think is that a recent development, the ability to employ your own staff?
Yes, it's not a recent development. We've always been allowed to appoint our own staff.
Okay.
Yeah, the only thing that they just give us, I think government will have to look at the budget and how many they can support. So they just give us the numbers, that for this year, we allow you to employ, let's say, 200. So we go ahead and employ the 200. We interview them ourselves and employ them, which is fine. It's good.
And I don't think that's necessarily the practice in all other countries. Many countries have to go through the Public Service Commission, if I'm not mistaken, to do their hiring.
Yeah, no, we are allowed to. We are allowed to do our own. So we interview them. We make the advert. We interview them sometimes in-house. If we don't have the time, then we can get consultants to do it on our behalf. But most of the time, we are always present to see to do that we want.
Well, Lawrence,
So then for
Go
that
ahead.
aspect, then I can say that we are lucky. You know,
Mhm.
yeah, I can say we are lucky.
Well, Lawrence, I think unfortunately we're out of time, but I want to thank you very much for this discussion. Hope to get back in touch again soon. Lawrence Ayagaba is the Deputy Auditor General. And that is our podcast for today. Politics and Public Finance is produced and sponsored by Huge Impact Marketing. Wherever you're listening to this podcast, be sure to subscribe. I'm Jeff Dubrow. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you next time.